Welcome to Culture and Causation. I'm Aaron Briley. Now, in this interview today, we'll discuss the 1619 Project, which has received a lot of attention over the past year, and I'm very excited to discuss it with my next guest. So my guest today is Dr. Peter Wood. Dr. Wood is the president of the National Association of Scholars. He received his undergraduate degree from Haverford College, his master's from Rutgers University, and his PhD in anthropology from the University of Rochester. Dr. Wood has authored several books. His latest book, which came out this year, is called 1620, A Critical Response to the 1619 Project. So, as I said, I look forward to discussing this project with him and more. So without further delay, Dr. Wood, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great, thank you. So I recently came across your article titled, America Wasn't Founded on Slavery in 1619, but on Pilgrim's Ideals, written in 1620. And I just want to say, just at the outset, that was a delight to read because it was extremely clear and it was extremely brief. So maybe we could start off with a quote from the article just to get us going. So I'll read a quote here and then I'll follow up with a question. So quote, you say, in August 1619, a pirate ship, the White Lion, stopped at Jamestown and traded 20-some captive Africans for food. The Africans were treated as indentured servants and soon released. 15 months later, in November 1620, an English ship blown off course on its way to Virginia ended up on the barren coast of Massachusetts. It landed more than 100 men, women, and children. These voyagers founded Plymouth Colony. And then you go on to write, quote, last year, the New York Times declared that the arrival of captives in Virginia was the true beginning of America, an America that the Times characterized as a slaveocracy. The Times called its campaign to promote this story the 1619 Project, unquote. So can you just maybe start off with telling us briefly what the 16 Project is or what it attempts to do?
The 1619 Project claims that it is going to reframe all of American history. By reframing, they essentially mean a narrative that runs counter to traditional and in most cases very well established records of what actually happened over the 4 preceding centuries. The aim of it is, I would say in a word, to delegitimize America. The America that I have in mind there is the America of a set of ideals that most Americans have recognized as founding principles of our country. So when Jefferson's draft of the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal, that's a statement of ideals. The 1619 Project, which was orchestrated and in part written by a journalist named Nicole Hannah-Jones, says that those ideals were false when they were written. Well, I'm not quite clear whether she meant when Jefferson wrote them in 1776 or when there were hints of them in earlier epochs of American history. But in any case, she's saying that the principles that most of us think of as the founding ideals of this nation, imperfectly realized at every stage, but still the ideals, she's saying were just phony. They were an excuse that was put up by people whose real intent was to engage in rapacious exploitation of other people, first of all Native Americans, but then Africans brought to the New World, and then their descendants, and that this system that emerged was really what it was all about. And in light of that, no reasonable person would have loyalty to such a country that adds to its crimes of racial oppression a vast hypocrisy in which that oppression is dressed up to look like it's an attempt to live lives of principle or to govern ourselves by principle. So it's a gauntlet thrown down, the 1619 Project. It says that Americans have misunderstood who they are, and the New York Times and Nicole Hannah-Jones and the other writers of that special issue of the New York Times Magazine in which this is laid out uh, are presenting us with the true history, and this is comes with a quote from John Hope Franklin that paraphrase says, "For the first time, we're telling the true history. It's never been told before. We're telling it here, and because we're telling it here, and we finally got it straight, we expect this to be adopted in the nation's schools and presented everywhere as the straight story of America's beginnings." So that's what it's about. I would say you can think of it as a kind of declaration of "I hate America." Those aren't the words that Nicole Hannah-Jones uses, but it's the tone of the entire document. And I think it invites, well, let's say at the very least, it invites skepticism towards the worthiness of a country like the United States. Beyond that, I think it invites a kind of radical alienation from the United States. This is not your country if you're Black, it says, and if you're white, then you are guilty of all the oppression that took place in the centuries before this moment and is still ongoing in the form of systemic racism.
Okay. Now, so I want to get to the criticism of this project, because it's one thing to say that, you know, it's a very sort of pessimistic and maybe, you know, malicious attack on our country's founding. But it's another thing maybe to sort of look at what parts of this project that they actually get wrong. So I was wondering if you could maybe highlight maybe one or two maybe central facts that this history of our founding gets wrong.
Right. Well, there are quite a few, but I think that the handful that really stand out to most people who have read it are, first, the founding of the United States in the form of the American Revolution, which, according to Nicole Hannah-Jones in her lead essay, this revolution was fought by Americans whose primary motive was to preserve the institution of slavery against the threat that the British government would abolish slavery. So we picked up arms and defended Bunker Hill in Boston and went on for 7 years fighting against British redcoats, all for the purpose of making sure that the British didn't take slavery away from us. Now, this is presented as a straightforward factual matter, something in the tone of as everybody knows or should know. But the fact is that there is just no evidence to support that claim at all. Normally, we would look to a single document for the reasons why Americans took up arms against the British. We call that document the Declaration of Independence. And if you read the whole thing, it has dozens of reasons why Americans should declare their independence. This idea of defending slavery is not mentioned. Well, you could say that the Declaration of Independence was part of that vast web of hypocrisy that was always covering up the real motives. So where would you go looking for the real motives? Well, you might go to the newspapers of the time. There were newspapers published in all the colonies. Most of them are extant. Historians have pored over them. We know what was in the newspapers prior to the American Revolution and during the American Revolution. And there's not a word in any of them about this is the reason we should declare our independence. Okay, so maybe the newspapers were in on the conspiracy too. Where else might we look? Well, we could look in the letters, the diaries of people who lived at the time. We could look at foreign commentators looking upon this event that's roiling the British Empire at that point. It doesn't really matter where you look. We cannot find a single individual living in what were to become the United States in 1774, 1775, 1776, and so on, who for a moment thought that the reason the colonies were rebelling was because they were afraid that the English crown was going to end slavery. On the other hand, Britain was at that point one of the principal slave traders in the whole world. It was profiting royally from sending African slaves to the Caribbean and to the colonies. In fact, the colonies were protesting that the British were intent on sending too many slaves to the colonies. Um, so we have reasons in the absence of evidence to support Nicole Hannah-Jones's claim, and the contrary evidence that exists in all other historical sources that says that the revolution was fought for other reasons. What other reasons? Well, things like no taxation without representation, or all men are created equal. The quarrel about the British quartering their troops in American households. You can go through a list that really does include dozens of complaints. We know those things to be true because they are backed up by other sources, not just any single source. So here's a case where a central claim of the 1619 Project is factually inaccurate. It's notoriously difficult to prove a negative, so maybe someday someone will discover the diary of some Southern farmer saying, well, I really don't like this American Revolution, but I'll revolt because I'm afraid the British are going to take my slaves away. Nobody has found that person yet, but you can't rule out the possibility that he exists somewhere. Nonetheless, that's the Times cornerstone of this claim about the revolution. Well, there's other things like that. In your introduction, you mentioned the ship, the White Lion, bringing slaves to Jamestown. Well, that's true. The White Lion was a pirate ship, British pirates who had intercepted a convoy of Spanish slave ships bringing slaves to Mexico for the silver mines. They captured the slaves on one of these ships, sold most of them in Bermuda, and took the remaining 20-some, no exact number, northward. They got caught in a storm. They were running out of provisions. They put in at, near Jamestown and traded the slaves for food. So you could be technically correct to say that's the beginning of slavery in the British colonies of North America, except that Jamestown didn't have a status for slaves. It assimilated these newcomers to the category of indentured servants, of which there were plenty of others, that is, people from England who came as indentured servants. An indentured servant served a few years and then was released. Well, that's exactly what happened to these African captives brought by the White Lion. They were released. Some of them became landowners, a couple of them quite wealthy landowners. They intermarried with the white population. One of them brought a lawsuit against a white neighbor and prevailed in Virginia court. So all the evidence we have suggests that this early arrival of slaves in Virginia resulted in a form of cultural, social, and legal integration. And slavery, of course, was going to happen in Virginia and be a terrible institution, but it didn't happen until about 50 years later. So there's a question: why does Nicole Hannah-Jones and the New York Times choose 1619 as the date at which American slavery began? Well, presumably they like the nice round number of 400 years from 1619 to 2019, but that's not much of a reason to distort the history. Now, of course, the records of that period are fragmentary. We don't know. Perhaps some of those captives were maltreated. Maybe some of them did end up as slaves. Nobody's been able to show that. What we do know about them is that they became free persons not long after they arrived. So there's two things: the American Revolution and the founding event that's claimed. But there's at least two others that stand out. The idea that Abraham Lincoln ignited the American Civil War because his real intent was to exile all people of African heritage from continental United States. And this war, which cost 600,000 lives, was really his project aimed at creating a profound new form of segregation. Then there's the claim that runs through the whole project that every advance that African Americans made over the course of these centuries was made solely by dint of their own efforts. Well, their own efforts amount to a great deal, but it's not true that the abolition movement was something started by African Americans. It was started generally by white Quakers in Pennsylvania and other religious dissenters before the Revolution. The abolition movement eventually gained adherents of all races and led, of course, as a major factor in igniting the Civil War. The civil rights movement in this country was not a Black-only affair. Even the founding of the NAACP in 1907, I think, was a multiracial endeavor. So the idea that it's only through Black self-help that any advance at all has been made towards liberty or freedom or the living up to American principles just isn't true. It's ahistorical. One runs through this 100-page document that the Times originally published as the 1619 Project, and almost every page you find these claims which are sometimes preposterous, like the claim about the American Revolution, sometimes just puzzling. I mean, why would one think that the interstate highway system was created as a tool for segregation? Well, I guess you can talk yourself into believing almost anything, but there is a sense as one reads through this document of constant reaching, as though we need to find a way to reinterpret every key fact of American history through the lens of racial oppression. Among the oddities, for example, one of the writers claims that American capitalism as we know it today is the result of plantation slavery and what he calls low road capitalism, that is striving to immiserate people to extract the greatest amount of labor from them for the least cost. All that is a legacy of slavery that condemns our economic system today. It is festooned with details such as the completely false claim that it was Southern plantation owners that invented double entry bookkeeping, which actually predates the plantation system by several hundred years and began in Italy. So you ask for examples of where the 1619 Project goes factually wrong. That's a collection of some of them. The factual errors are, I think, important. We don't want those to be taught as though they're true to students or to even just readers of the Times. But I think behind the factual errors lies this larger effort to demonize the country, to treat it as something that was unworthy from the start and is really unworthy to this day.
And because I have a couple more questions, but hearing this, it just sounds like these, like you said, these claims are completely arbitrary. They're unsubstantiated, very flimsy. You know, they're on a very flimsy foundation. So I want to know, how is this received? How has this project been received in the culture, in the country, and in the culture? People are taking this seriously, right?
It's being taken very seriously indeed. You know, it's the kind of question you're asking. Ideally, would be one that might be answered by extensive surveys and asking hundreds of thousands of people what they think of it. I'll give you my experience so far. Before the shutdown, and I was doing a lot of traveling around the country, I always asked audiences how many people there knew what the 1619 Project was. And very seldom did anybody even raise a hand. I think that there was a period in which the 1619 Project, despite the Times having spent a lot of money and a lot of effort to promote it, hadn't really penetrated to very many Americans. But I know that that's a selective kind of sample because the groups in which I was invited to speak to were largely white. They were middle class or affluent people who had just tuned this out. In the meantime, Nicole Hannah-Jones was on the lecture circuit around the country, and I've watched many of her talks because they were videoed and the videos were posted. So she was able to draw very substantial audiences Many of them were full of people who were just um, thrilled with not only the opportunity to meet her, the hero of the day, but to be able to speak up to say, along with the New York Times, our story is finally being told truthfully for the first time. So I think that its penetration in the Black community in America has been very deep and very powerful. It has also attracted a lot of support from the American left, so groups that aren't normally thought of as allies of the Black community, like the Howard Zinn Association. It's not quite its name, but Zinn was a American communist who wrote a important book titled "The People's History of the U.S." Have adopted this as well. It's become a talking point as I meet people of sort of whose politics are pretty well defined as well left of center. I find that the 1619 project is generally accepted at face value. I've been doing a lot of interviews related to my book. In one case, the person who was interviewing me was quite adamant that this 1619 project was a turning point in our history, as just a wonderful opening where the truth was finally being told. So I've had that said to me face to face. I've tried to push back against that, as in, you say this is true, but it's not really true, at least not on the facts. And with that, I met with something along the lines of, well, you have your truth, I have mine. So a strange relativism comes to the aid of the New York Times in this, that people are so eager to believe that it's true that they're ready to go out on the postmodern limb of saying truth is whatever we decide it is. And today we've decided that the 1619 project speaks to the most profound realities. Well, I do my best to summon some kind of sympathy for that. If your worldview is founded on victimhood and on the idea that racism defines everything, then the 1619 project gives you a place to sit down where you can take comfort that authorities are saying, yes, you're right. It's been a racist conspiracy from the start, still is, always will be. There's no way out of it. Let's just reconcile ourselves to the fact that this is a racial grudge match in this country, has always been, and we can't expect it to be any better unless we take matters into our own hands. Now that brings me to the last thing I'll say in answer to this question. When the riots broke out after the death of George Floyd in police custody in Minneapolis, they spread pretty rapidly to many towns and cities. One commentator made the connection and said, we could call these the 1619 riots, given how much racial division had been stirred up by Nikole Hannah-Jones. Nikole Hannah-Jones, who's a prolific tweeter, responded very quickly to say that she would own that. Yeah, they are the 1619 riots, and she liked that. So there is a connection between the playing out of racial animus in our country right now and the efforts of Nikole Hannah-Jones and the New York Times generally to build on these tensions and make of them something magnified, greater, more hostile than ever before. That's where I think this comes out.
Well, my last question is, now in your opinion, is this part of a larger campaign against objectivity in our culture? I mean, it seems like it is, because there's social justice campaigns and multiculturalism and all these things in academia and elsewhere. Is this your take on what's happening?
Yes, it is. A moment ago, I used the phrase postmodernism, and I use that in my book as well. postmodernism being the idea that there is no objectivity, no fact can be known, everything is a matter of interpretation. So I do believe that the Times here knowingly misstated some things because they thought that there was a larger good to be obtained. There's many ways to go after objectivity. You can believe that there is no such thing, or you can believe there is such a thing, but it's a detriment to pursuing some larger goal. I'm not quite sure how that plays out in this case. Certainly, the Times was alerted that there were mistakes, falsehoods, perhaps even lies in the 1619 project, but it went ahead with them anyway. That is an attack on objectivity for sure. Is this part of a larger thing? Well, yes. My day job is as president of the National Association of Scholars. I deal with problems all the time that arise from the efforts to promote social justice at the expense of rational or reasonable intellectual inquiry into the facts of the matter. This attack on objectivity has now moved on from the humanities and social sciences, even into the natural sciences, where we're told that the pursuit of social justice in some mysterious way has to trump the pursuit of truth. So yes, I think you have named it correctly. Objectivity here falls by the wayside as we see our nation descend into this acrimonious fight over who to blame and who to shame.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Wood. This has been very insightful. My last question is, where can people find you online if they want to learn more about you and about what you do?
Well, the National Association of Scholars website is just nas.org. You can find a lot about what I do there. I'm pretty widely published and easy to find, and I'm happy to give out my regular email address, which is pwood@nas.org. I do my best to keep up with everybody who writes to me, so as long as you don't write to me in a spirit of vitriol, I will try to answer you to the best of my ability.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Great.